I already tested AI in Armenia. Now it's time for Turkey, starting with Istanbul, then Antalya, and finally Kemer. Once again, I decided to use AI as my travel assistant. In my case, I used ChatGPT, but the real question was simple. Would it actually help me, or would everything go completely off track? I landed in Istanbul from Yerevan without preparing anything in advance. First, because I simply didn't have the time, and second, because I wanted to see whether AI could really become my personal guide in a city I had never visited before. As soon as I arrived, I headed straight to the metro. The metro ride to my hostel took about an hour and a half. I booked a place right in the historic center, close to Sirkeci. After checking in, I immediately asked AI to recommend places where locals actually eat instead of tourist restaurants. While I was having lunch, I asked AI to plan the rest of my day. I wanted something more active. AI suggested taking a ferry to Karakoy. One interesting thing I noticed was that you could only board the ferry using an Istanbul card. Cash wasn't accepted. I was honestly surprised by how cheap the ferry rides were. If I remember correctly, most trips cost somewhere between $3. After arriving in Karakoy, I spent some time walking around the neighborhood. So after exploring for a while, I headed back. Before going to bed that evening, I asked AI one more question. Plan an active adventure for tomorrow. The next morning, I had an entire free day ahead of me and wanted to do something memorable. AI suggested visiting the Princess Islands, also known as Adalar. It told me the ferry ride would take around an hour and a half to 2 hours, but it also gave me one important piece of advice. Make sure to check the schedule for the last ferry back to the city so you don't end up stranded on the island. After breakfast, I headed to Kabatash. I spent a little time walking around the area. Next, I checked the ferry schedule and boarded the next boat to the islands. On the way, the ferry stopped at several different islands before finally reaching the largest one. As soon as I arrived, I realized I had a small problem. My Istanbul card was almost out of money. The return ticket was more expensive than I expected. While I was sailing across the sea, I kept thinking about how I was going to solve this. I already knew that many ticket machines only accepted bank cards, and my card didn't work in Turkey. For a while, I thought I might have to ask another traveler for help or somehow find another solution. Luckily, everything worked out. I found a machine that accepted cash, topped up my Istanbul card, and finally started my adventure. It had been raining earlier that morning, and the trail was still wet. The entire route to the top was almost completely uphill. The climb took around an hour, but every minute was worth it. The higher I climbed, the more incredible the scenery became. The atmosphere was absolutely unforgettable. Fresh air, endless forests, the sound of birds, and breathtaking views over the sea. If you enjoy hiking and nature, this place is definitely worth visiting. Eventually, I reached the highest point on the island. The panoramic view from the top was simply spectacular. Sometimes it's nice to stop for a moment and just appreciate where you are. After spending some time at the summit, I slowly made my way back down toward the coastline. I walked along the waterfront for a while before returning to the ferry terminal. Then it was time to head back to Istanbul. While sitting on the ferry, I asked AI one more question. I still had several hours left before the end of the day, so I wanted another recommendation. This time, it suggested visiting Kadıköy. According to AI, the neighborhood has a more modern atmosphere with a younger crowd and a completely different vibe compared to the historic center. So that's exactly where I went. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking around Kadıköy. Eventually, I reached the Fenerbahce stadium and continued toward the waterfront. AI was right. The atmosphere here felt completely different from the historic center of Istanbul. There were people everywhere, relaxing by the sea, sitting on the grass, chatting with friends, and simply enjoying the evening. The weather was perfect, the sun was shining, and the whole place had a very calm and relaxed vibe. It felt like the kind of neighborhood where you could spend hours doing absolutely nothing and still have a great time. After watching the sunset by the water, I took the ferry back to Eminönü, returned to my hostel, and got some sleep. The next morning, it was time for the next part of my journey. I flew from Istanbul to Antalya, and if you are curious about the first part of this experiment, where I tested AI while traveling through Armenia, you can find that video on my channel as well.